Good evening and welcome to another in our series, Personal Finances. And maybe you can see up here on our screen the 7 deadly sins of estate planning. This is our topic tonight, interesting topic. And we're just glad that you're here, and those on streaming, we want to welcome you. Before we begin, we'd like to have a word of prayer. Let's bow our heads. Father in heaven, today we just want to praise you and invite your presence as we look at some things here with finances, an important topic to you, many times in the Bible. But today, Lord, we just ask for clear vision, for open minds as we listen tonight and learn something new, and we give praise to you in your name. Amen.
Thank you very much. Good to be with you. And we're unpacking a topic here that is one that I spend a bit of my day working on. Now, if I can just get rid of that. It is again. There should only be 2 of those. Maximum of 3, so we'll get rid of it and should be good. So just to reiterate what I said our first night together, to remind you, we are talking about estate plans, but I'm not a lawyer. I do a fair amount of work, in fact, quite a bit of work between clients and the lawyer. So I have at least a little familiarity with it, but I am not here to give legal opinions on anything. But I do want to maybe start by doing a little myth busting, at least for some people. These are probably a couple things that I hear quite often. Number one is that probate is the worst thing that can ever happen to you. I mean, it's just awful. I'd like to pop that balloon, at least for states like Washington, Idaho. Probate, what is probate? If you were to define it in a sentence or two, what is probate? It's the orderly process of transferring what you own to someone else. So it's making sure that your wishes are followed. If you have a will, it's going to be probate. If you don't have a will, then it's going to go into intestate succession to somebody else. But probate is merely the process of making sure that whatever you own, which now has no owner, gets to the right person. Now, a lot of states in the more recent past have adopted what's called the Simplified Probate Code. And they've made probate easier than it was, less expensive than it was. It's not as protracted. It's really not a bad process. In fact, skipping probate sometimes can have impact in terms of when you're done with probate, if somebody comes up as a creditor after the fact, they have no standing. But bypass that, and you still could be liable. You've received as a beneficiary, and yet now the estate is liable for that. So discharging debts, or at least putting a limit on when debts can come into the estate, very helpful. Here in Washington, probate is really quite simple. It's not a big process. It doesn't have continual reporting back to the court by the executor on a quarterly basis, for example, and letting the judge know where you are in the process. You just report back. I'm finishing one. It's been a couple years. It's been the worst one that I've ever dealt with. We haven't gone back to the court except to file one piece of paper, but it's about 2 years, and now we're ready to file the closing report that says, here's what the beneficiary's got, here's the assets we found, here's the liabilities we paid off. The judge signs off, and we're done. So Number one, probate is not a big bad thing. Now, it used to be more difficult. California, different story. People with very small estates get trusts to avoid probate. We used to do a ton of trusts here in Washington. We are known as the trust department because we did a lot of trusts. But we can't genuinely tell people they need one in many, many cases. And many people will spend much more money setting up a trust to avoid probate than they ever would if they did probate. So just a little bit of an explanation there on that. Number two, sometimes I hear people say, you know, isn't it terrible how the government comes in with estate taxes and just takes a huge amount away from your estate? Well, at least if you're here in Washington and they come and take something away from your estate, it probably means that you had a pretty decent sized estate. Here in Washington, you can shelter almost $2.2 million before estate taxes will kick in per person. So I want to say, bring on the estate taxes. I mean, I'd love to be at risk. I'd really like to be at risk of the federal estate tax. That's currently just over $12 million per person. You can double it up at the federal level. Washington, it's a little different, but at the federal level, you can have a $24 million estate, do no special planning to avoid taxes, and it's only when you crest that 24 million that you would be taxed on what is above that. So estate taxes, they used to catch some of the more people with larger estates. You've got to have a pretty good size estate to be caught by estate taxes. I just wish I was at risk of federal estate taxes. I'd pay. It'd be great. So those are just a couple little things that you may hear, I hear, and kind of interesting, especially when you realize the federal is so high, it catches a fraction of a percent of estates in the U.S. It's just people don't have, by and large, those kinds of estates. And those who do, with some planning, usually bypass, you know, if they've got 50 or 100 million, with some planning they get around that. So the estate tax doesn't hit many people at the federal level. Oregon, I think, is $1 million, so it's a little lower. Idaho has no tax. And by the way, from a technical standpoint, the difference between an estate tax and inheritance tax. An inheritance tax means that as the receiver, I am taxed. An estate tax means the estate is taxed before it distributes to me and other people. Idaho has neither. So, million, I think, in Oregon, 2.193, almost 2.2 here in Washington, and but federal, don't have to worry about it at all. I have some handouts, and I failed to get them out, but so far nothing on them that we've talked about will be on them. And you can just send any extras to the end, and I'll try to remember to pick them up at the end. I won't be saying much more about it, just that an inheritance tax, Washington doesn't have an inheritance tax. Oregon, Idaho, there are probably a couple ones that do that tax the recipient. So that's the difference between an estate tax is on the estate before it goes out. An inheritance tax would tax, if my parents left me a significant amount of money, I might be taxed myself with an inheritance tax. So that's the difference. Most states have moved away from any inheritance tax if they have anything, it tends to be an estate tax. So, all right, we'll move through 7 deadly sins of estate planning. Number 1 is not doing anything. Okay, number 1 is not doing anything because, for example, it takes too long. Some people feel the process is very difficult. They'll ask when they meet with me, besides everything else, do we need to bring our 1040 tax statements from the year? Do we need to bring birth certificates and marriage certificates and all this? And it turns out that for most people, about 90 minutes will kind of launch the estate planning process. It will then take some time with the attorney and review, etc., but it does not take a long time. Usually we meet for about an hour and a half. Young families are the ones that take the longest because they're trying to figure out, is your brother or my sister going to have the kids if something happens to us? That doubles the time of the appointment, and often they go away and say, we'll get back to you because we can't figure out or agree or whatever. But estate planning tends to be, with a little forethought and a little preparation, not a terribly long endeavor. Occasionally, you hear people think or say that doing an estate plan will somehow hasten my death. You know, thinking about it, it's kind of like going to the doctor will make me ill. Working on an estate plan will hasten my demise. In fact, even this is not a new thing. Ellen White has a couple statements trying to remind people that doing a will not hasten my death by one day. So it's something that worries people, just having to think about the possibility of my passing away. They don't want to think about it, and so they don't do it. They put it off. Or number 3, it might give people power over me. I had a very sweet young lady. She was also extremely hard of hearing. And I met with her. She wanted to work on an estate plan. I met several times. She was the most hard of hearing person I think I've ever dealt with. And the only client that I've ever yelled at, and that's because I had to do all of our conversation yelling. She sat here, and I sat within just a couple feet of her. And I would, when I left, I would be hoarse because I'm yelling, and she's got her hand cupped over her ear. And it came down, she had very clear ideas, she was very lucid, all of that. But it came down, she was afraid that if she put some people's names in her estate plan, that somehow they would have power to put her in a nursing home. And I could not convince her that she had the opportunity to tell who makes decisions if she doesn't have capacity, rather than a court appointing somebody. I could never get it through. We had appointment after appointment after appointment, and she knew everything else, but she couldn't bring herself to move forwards. And ultimately, I had to tell, it just went over the course of months and years. And I finally had to say, I cannot go further because I'm afraid that by that time, some of her capacity was drifting down. We try to be very careful. And so, as far as I knew, it was completely lost. And she had a big charitable intent, and she had no family, and she loved her church. To our surprise, several years later, we got a letter from an attorney saying that she had come to him, and he was in a better position to make an estate plan because he wasn't receiving anything from it, so he could step where I wasn't willing to step, and she left a very sizable donation. So God helped see her desires through, even where I had to back through. But for her, she was afraid that it would give somebody authority that she didn't want them to have. Number two of the big problems with estate planning is failing to review your plan periodically. So how often should you review your plan? Not necessarily sitting down with somebody who works on them, but just how often might be a good idea to pull yours out and take a look at it? Any thoughts? Maybe it's a once and done. You hated talking about it to begin with, so you never want to see it again. Okay, great. Yes. That's you're anticipating my next question. What would be some of those big changes, some of those life events that would maybe be something that I should review my estate plan? Okay, changes in your health. Death of a spouse would be a big one. Divorce. Birth of a child, especially the first one. Now, why is the first one much more special? Well, because I'm a firstborn, of course. Well, no. The deal with the firstborn is when you get your estate plan written, the guardianship, trusteeship, everything that makes young families' wills about twice as big as everybody else's, the language the attorney puts in is he says, this child, this is my child, and here's my guardian, trustee, etc. for this child and any future children. So actually, if you don't update it, life would go on pretty decently. If something happened, the guardian would apply to that child and all the rest. If there was a division of assets down the road, all the rest would be equally included. So that first one, that's a big life event. So birth of a child, death of a family member, etc. Those are key times to at least review it and see if things have changed in a substantial way that might be significant. It could be significant because you've named that individual to a key position. Maybe they were going to be an executor or an attorney in fact, somebody on your health care or your finances. So it could be that you no longer have a primary person in there. And if you haven't named alternates, you might have just run out of those names. Now, normally we encourage people to have a primary and two alternates. So if something does happen, there's somebody that would be the backup and a backup to the backup. So, yes? Okay, and especially, now, and we'll talk a little later about how you structure your will, but if you come into a significant amount of assets that changes everything, that could be a game changer, especially if it's an inheritance. We live in a community property state. Inheritances are not community property. Whoever inherited them in the relationship keeps them. Now, you can commingle them if you choose, but they will be your separate property. Whereas everything else that comes into the relationship during your marriage is community property, which means it's split 50-50. Many people think community property means what's yours is mine and what's mine is yours. No. My wife has been working for a number of years now, but most of our time, she helped me, and there was no pay for her, living in a community property state. What I earn is ours 50-50. But if she inherits, she can keep that separate, and that is just her sole property, unless she chooses to commingle it by putting it into our joint checking account, etc., joint investments, joint, that type of thing. So yes, not only when you come into a significant amount of assets that's a game changer, but especially an inheritance, probably wasn't mentioned in the will, and it might be that what you inherited, it could be property, maybe, that you want to keep in the family. You don't want to transfer to a spouse. Maybe if something happens to you, you want to go, that portion to go direct to your kids or to siblings or something like that to keep it in the family. So Yes, great. Any other life events that you can think of that might be a trigger for reviewing your estate plan? All right, let's go on to number 3. Here's a big one. This is one of the big fallacies. Assuming that your will covers everything, and I put a subtitle there, or thinking that your probate estate is everything. So your probate estate is a fancy word for just saying everything that's covered by your will. But not everything is covered by your will. So there's the definition for probate, the legal process for establishing your will. So that's when they say establishing your will, that's making sure that you're doing the right one, which is normally the last one. We talk about your last will, and it's your last will because you can't make any more. So it's usually the latest date, unless you can figure out some way to challenge it and say the last one was done under duress, and so we should go back to an earlier one or something like that. But the legal process for establishing your will and making sure its provisions are followed. So let me give you an illustration. And this may look a little complicated and confusing, and that's why it's one of the deadly sins if you ignore it. Let's assume that Mr. Schlotsky has an estate consisting of these different things, which actually is pretty reflective of many people's things. He's got some real estate, he's got personal property, he's got life insurance, a savings account, he's got some retirement accounts, it's the IRA, 401k, and then he's got some investments that are not retirement accounts. And let's imagine that his estate is a very small estate. It's worth $500,000. And I say small. It's not that we don't deal with a lot of people with less than that, but usually if you have some real estate and a little else thrown in, $500,000 is kind of on the smaller side for many people, especially if you own property in Spokane County. So let's imagine that he has this, and then he has a wife, he has his children, and he has a brother that he wants to remember. And so his will has apportioned out his $500,000 estate to these different individuals. But when Mr. Schlotsky passes away, they sit down and they start inspecting everything to take a look. And in his will, he's identified that he wants 90% to go to his wife, 10% to his children. He has not indicated his brother in the will. But as they continue to work through, they take a look at some of the beneficiary designations or contracts that he had. And he has some investments, and the investments named his children as beneficiaries. Who's going to get it? The will said my investments to my children, 10% to my children, 90% to my wife. The beneficiary designation on his investments say to my children. Where's it going to go? It's going to go to the children. The will has the lowest level. Everything else pretty well trumps it. So he's on his investments. He's put, when you had to fill out those long forms, and he was just getting going, and he just said, sure, my children. But in his will, he knew he'd taken care of everything. I mean, his will really is about everything. So he knew that most of it would go to his wife, 10% to his kids. It'd all be great, except that he didn't do that on his investments. And then on his IRA, he just puts down his son's name. He doesn't say my children or anything like that. He puts down his son's name. Where is it going to go? It's going to go to his son. It might be a big retirement account. He may have paid into it for years, and this is what he's hoping will give cash for his wife while she continues. She's got real estate, but you can't live on real estate. I mean, you can, you're in your house, but you can't take it to the bank. unless you do a reverse mortgage. But in this case, their son gets it. And then life insurance, he's actually put his wife as primary and his brother as a contingent beneficiary. Okay, well, his wife's going to get that. And then we've got what's called operation of law, of which the beneficiary designation kind of fits in there, but operation of law especially deals with contracts and real estate. In Washington, you can put a deed that has it's called a transfer on death deed. Didn't used to have these, but more and more states are picking them up, so they're like a beneficiary designation. You can actually say, I own this property, but when I die, I want it to go to and name someone else. How does that interact with the will? It trumps it. It trumps it. And so he just put his brother on there back before he was ever married, and he never took it off. He passes away, and his wife is instantly a tenant of his brother. Hopefully she got along with him. Maybe not. One of my trust officers, who's also a lawyer, tells the story of sitting down with a family who wanted to do kind of a reading of the will. And as he says, that's the stuff of TV. It's not the stuff we really do. You usually get the notice from the attorney, etc. But they wanted to sit around a big table, and as he tells the story, high drama, this was a blended family, which is always much more fun. Later in life, marriage, already two established families. But the will left everything to the one side of the family. And that was all great, and that side was happy, and the other side was sad. And then one of the people over here pulled out a piece of paper and said, does this make any difference? And they shoved across a deed. The deed favored the other side of the family completely. And all of a sudden, the mourning started on this side and the jubilation started on this side. So what's the point? Make sure that your beneficiary designations, etc., either complement or go with your will. Because you are doing estate planning when you fill out any of those documents. Now, when you sit down to write a will, you know you're doing estate planning, so you're thinking very carefully about that. But when you fill out life insurance, you're not thinking that this could be a significant chunk of your estate. And when they ask you, who do you want to put in there? And so you just say, well, I got to do something. Let's put the kids or whatever. You're doing estate planning, and as long as it works together in harmony, that's great. But if it works at cross purposes, I sit down with lots of people who, when we're all said and done, they tell me what they want to do on their estate plan, and there isn't a single asset that will control. They've told me they've got beneficiaries on every account, their investment accounts, their retirement accounts, their life insurance, and all of that, but they have big plans for their will. There's nothing to, it's not going to go anywhere. They've put their kids' names on some of the checking accounts and savings accounts, and the land, it's got a transfer on death deed. It's like, well, what are we doing here? I guess maybe we're working with personal effects, where your garden tractor and your, coin collection will go. So make sure it works together. And there are a number of tools you can do. For example, on some of these things, instead of putting individual people's names, you can just put my estate. Those two words, my estate. And then it will flow according to your will. That may be beneficial. Here's the reason. You can sit down in one place and change where things go as your kids' needs change or their life circumstances change. You can change it in one spot rather than trying to remember, did I change it over there? Well, how about here? Now, how does that look if I put that with this? So something to think about. Not a hard and fast recommendation. There's good reasons to do either putting my estate or to leave things to kids. There's tax reasons for some of those, but just make sure that they're all working congruently together. Make sense? Okay. Number 4. Number 4 is what I call flow charting, or not keeping it simple. I sometimes meet with people who are so excited to be doing their will, and when they put everything together, and for the first time, they've got all their assets lined up, and they realize that they're worth 6 figures. Now, it might be a very low 6 figures, but they feel like they are getting close to Bill Gates. Some of the people with the least assets are the ones that have the most complex plans of how to gift this. And then occasionally I even get them who it feels like they want to remember half the people in their high school yearbook. I kid you not. I think the highest I had was somewhere in the 40s for beneficiaries. Now, they didn't have that much money, but they felt wealthy, and so they wanted to spread the wealth around, and I could not talk them out in any way to remind them that probably by the time they pass away, they've spent a little time, at the end of life, you're using money, not earning money. By the time you get there, that your executor may be writing checks that are, $57 to 48 people that they can't find anyway, at least half of them. But anyway, keeping it simple. One of the challenges is giving specific assets to individuals. Now, not a big deal if you've got something that's meaningful like a piano, and you know that one of the kids wants the piano. Perfectly fine. But what I'm talking about, and I see it, is sitting down, and they've listed out their assets, which we asked them to do beforehand because the attorney needs to know, are there any kinds of things that I should advise tax-wise or otherwise? So we asked for just a rough rundown. Things are rounded to the nearest thousand, or real estate 25 or 50,000, just round numbers, but at least the attorney knows what we're dealing with. Well, having done that, they want to give specific assets to specific children. And so they want to give this parcel of land to this child. They want to give these antique cars to this child. And they parcel out the entire estate like that. What's the problem with that? I mean, it makes sense, right? You know the kid's interests, etc. You want to make sure that they have those things. What's the problem? 10 years down the road, do you think they own all those same assets? Good chance not. And certainly 20 years down the road, something will have been sold. And if you named different kids, there is a good likelihood that that kid's out in the cold, right? If you said, I want him to have this piece of property, and I want her to have all the retirement accounts, and I want him to have, and you go through, if you parcel it out, they can't imagine life changing, but life changes. I've sat down with people who they had lots of parcels of land, and so every kid got a parcel of land, and the values were about the same. 20 years from now, will the values probably be the same? Probably not. So one kid is going to have more, one kid will have less, and somehow it might introduce a tiny bit of disharmony in the family. Plus, it's just a pain. I mean, the next time I met them, they'd already sold 2 parcels, and it hadn't been 7 years. Well, 2 kids were going to be out in the cold if that's what they did. So what's better than that? I think I've described what we're doing. I was just going to describe it up here. But you can see if you parcel those out, it becomes a problem, a big problem. Take real estate. It will probably be the last significant thing that most people own in their estate. Most people will, real estate will be the last, because your retirement account, what's it doing after you retire? A decent chance it's dropping. I mean, you're required to take, at least depending on the retirement vehicle, you're required to take some minimum distributions, right? That are calculated on your age. They're designed to kind of follow you along and be consumed. Other things will go down. Real estate tends to be one of the latter ones. But if health goes down or you decide to relocate to be by the kids, what's the last big asset to be sold? The real estate. And where does it go? It goes into checking. We see people who they'll gift the house to one child who might be interested in it, and the rest, they'll actually say, the rest divide up my cash. Well, if they die just before they sell it versus dying just after they sell it, it tips the scales in amazing ways, right? Either one person pretty well was the full winner of the house and there wasn't much else left, or suddenly that account, that checking account that had nothing in it, now has $300,000 sitting in it. And whichever child was left with the cash came out good. So what do we do? What's better than that? Our recommendation, other than gifting pianos or musical instruments or china or tools or the things that have memories or the things that are particularly interesting to the kids, we recommend that a person use percentages. It's actually pretty simple. If you buy or sell property, if you've taken a percentage of your estate, does it matter? It doesn't. You can acquire 2 more pieces of property, but if you've said, I want my spouse to have 50% of my estate, and I want my 4 kids to divide the other 50% of my estate, whether you acquire property or whether you sell it and now have a big checking account, whether you have a big retirement account or a small one, they're still going to get the same fraction, aren't they? We even see it in ways that have some very unintended consequences dealing with the church. Mr. Smith may sit down and say, look, I want to do an estate plan, and I want to do it with you guys because I have a real concern for my local church, and so I want to leave something to my local church, something to my kids. And he's got an estate, let's say $500,000. And he says, I've been in the habit of giving a tithe. I want to give a tithe to my local church, and then the rest would be divided evenly among my 3 or 4 kids. But he says, let's go ahead and put it this way. I want to put it 50,000, which would be my tithe, to my local church, and 450,000 divided, and the remainder divided among my kids. What's the problem with that? If that estate doesn't go up, but it goes down, what's given off the top? Any financial cash gift comes off the top before what we call residue. Residue is what remains. If we were to use a good Adventist term, it would be the remnant. It's the remnant of my estate, what's left. And we have actually seen this. And it leads to unintended consequences and hard feelings all the way around. Suppose when he passes away, he's had what nobody expects, but too many people have, is an extended nursing home stay. His estate is now $100,000. What happened to his nice little 90% to the kids, 10% to the church? Well, it went in ways that will leave the kids unhappy. They can't be unhappy at dad, so they'll be unhappy at the church. And it wasn't what he intended for the church. The church didn't necessarily ask for that. But the local church can sometimes, those kids will pull away from the local church or whatever, because now the local church got 50% of dad's estate when he was wanting to leave 10%. Let's get rid of all those. That's how. Okay, so we've talked about giving specific assets to individuals, using numbers versus percentages. And one more that I'd mention that I don't have popped up there would be, as far as keeping it simple, would be I sometimes see people who want to control, we call it control from the grave. And often it's the best of intentions. They want to encourage those behaviors that they didn't see in life, and they're hoping that those behaviors would come after they pass away. I had one, this was as a young pastor. This is before I came into estate planning. But a very committed individual said, here, I want to give my house to my kids so long as, and that's where we get worried when they have the so long as. He said, so long as they remain committed Adventists, and he gave a couple indicators. They're faithfully returning tithe. Well, where does that put the church treasurer in this whole thing? I kid you not, this is a real story. This is not made up, etc. And so he listed a couple of these, and the estate was supposed to get a report from the local pastor. Now tell me what that does for the pastor's ability to reach out and nurture these kids who are already estranged, and he's trying to bring them back. It only drove the wedge deeper. It widened the chasm. I couldn't even hardly talk to them. They were so angry. And there came a day when they had to relinquish the house. And on their way out, they ripped sinks off the wall and did damage, left the water, running or whatever. His intentions were good, but his methods were messy. Control from the grave just doesn't work. And none of you would do it. But I say it for somebody else who might ever be listening. But just think about that. It's one of those challenges that I see. It makes for a couple good stories, but sad endings. And number 5, failing to prepare the children for the money. There's a saying that goes around, at least in estate planning, and it's more, actually, I should say, I got it from more the wealth planning side of the industry. We are not, as I told you, I'm not a money manager, advisor, or whatever, but it's the phrase shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations. You have a sense of what that means? Grandpa was a visionary and hardworking individual. He built, a nice little business, actually a pretty good-sized business. Dad took over, and he was pretty solid. He trained under Grandpa. He's pretty solid, but he didn't have that visionary and that first world drive. And then along came the grandkids, who all they'd known was a pretty nice life. They hadn't known the immigrant life that Grandpa had. And by the end of their lives, by the time it could go back or go to the great-grandchildren, it's all been spent. So it goes up, build it up, and down. And so sometimes, even in estate planning, we talk about how do we prepare the family. A lot of people spend a ton of time preparing the money. They've spent a lifetime, and they're excited to be able to gift this on and see it bless their kids. I mean, what's more exciting than that? But sometimes maybe they forget, how can we prepare the kids for the money? And I've seen some people do some really fun and creative things. I have one individual, good friends of mine, and what they have done in their will is they gave their kids nice, ample inheritance, but they also said, kids, here's some extra money that we want you to do gifting in line with what would interest us, but within that universe of interesting things, you get to be the giver. You see, they wanted to try to help them be givers and not just receivers. So while they received a nice amount, they were also saying, what would mom and dad like? And how does that passion intersect with my passions? And how can we make a difference? There's just one more way that they were trying to do what they'd done in life, preparing the kids for the money, to make sure that the money was a blessing for them and not something that would be a curse. And unfortunately, we do see that. You probably know families where that has happened, where what was designed to be that final blessing, that final I love you from their parents in the monetary form, ended up blowing the family apart. And so preparing the family in whatever way, but just sharing your values, etc. It's something that ideally goes on through a lifetime, but it may be as simple as saying, we recently went to a lawyer and we've made some plans and we want to share them with you so you know where we're headed. There might be a surprise or two in there. You may have thought that it was all coming to you, and yet our passion for our local church. We've poured our hearts into that congregation and we want to do something. Well, it's a time where they can talk that out, etc. So making sure that your family's ready for the estate plan. And interestingly enough, families who give as a family actually do better than those who don't. So giving along the way as a precursor to encourage them that they may be able to do some things with what they get that won't just be about their families. Oh, yeah, this third question is, how much should you give? Well, I obviously have no answer for that. But I did like this one by Warren Buffett. You've probably heard it. He does have some catchy phrases, but here's what he said when asked about how much he was going to leave. And of course, he's in a different category than most everybody else that walks this earth. There are a couple in his category, but not many who have that much to leave. But what he said was, you should leave your children enough so that they can do something, but not enough so that they can do nothing. That's probably some good advice. However, it can be applied in my little checkbook. I don't know. Number 6, here's a big one. Not doing a prenuptial agreement. Obviously, we're dealing here with second marriages. Not suggesting that you do that on the first marriage. But what's the benefit and or purpose of a prenuptial agreement? Anybody want to help me out with that one? It really is. Mom and dad over here worked a good part of their life. Mom and dad over here worked a good part of their life. And when kids see, mom who's a widow and over here dad who's a widower, and they start to get together, one of the best things you can do to bring family on board is to let them know that you have a plan that doesn't forget either family. We see far too many wills where people get together, and yes, as we get older, we're a little lonely and we find somebody, and one of my colleagues calls it the I love you will. It just says everything to you, dear, and the other one says everything to you, dear. And the winner who keeps their parent alive last is the winner. Boy, does that alienate families. It's a sure way to make sure that, those two people who, no, they can't rebuild the past, but they can share a shared future. We'll have angry kids in life, let alone in death. So we get some pushback against this sometimes when people come in. It's like, hey, why are you saying that? Here you are. I come to, it hasn't happened to me, but it's happened to one of my colleagues. Here I come to the Adventist Church for estate planning, and you're helping me prepare for a divorce already, and we're just getting married. I mean, we're looking at a prenuptial agreement. Like, no. In fact, one case I remember being told about, actual case, the man just threw a fit. Why are you doing this? Why are you recommending a prenuptial agreement? We come here to make our marriage solid, and you're trying to get ready to split it apart. Well, it turned out, which didn't take much looking, to realize that she was pretty wealthy, and he was not. She was his retirement program. He didn't want a prenuptial agreement that left things to the family. If something happened to her, he wanted to make sure that large estate came his way and not to her kids. He didn't have a big concern about divorce. He was concerned about the money. And so when the suggestion was made, it would be good for your families, as you've said, to do a prenuptial agreement, he was very unhappy. So a prenuptial agreement it really launches this second relationship that hopefully will be a blessing in those latter years. It can just bring the families on board, etc. So it's not about divorce, it's about fostering the best environment for those later years. And number 7, doing estate planning on your own. What does it cost to do an estate plan? A typical will probably run, you can get them a little under $1,000 up to $2,000. More expensive lawyer downtown will be a little north of that. This gentleman here is Chief Justice Warren. He's Chief Justice, what is it, William Berger? It's one of our justices. Apparently he did his own will. Now, he was an expert in the Constitution, but he wasn't an expert in doing your own wills. And at least by some suggestions, and it's been all over the news quite some time ago, that doing his own will making, that wasn't his specialty, cost him $450,000. And he's the Chief Justice, or was the Chief Justice. And bottom line is, there's been some argument about what mistakes he made, etc., but it wasn't his area. So a good lawyer is well worth your money, wherever you go. And what we just say, have a good estate plan. If we can be part of the process, we're happy to. But you really don't want to do it on your own. Forbes actually called do-it-yourself estate planning a uniquely bad idea. That was their take on it. And Consumer Reports, after testing 3 will writing options, web or software, Consumer Reports concluded that all 3 of the estate planning software, all 3 were inadequate unless a very simple plan was required, such as one that leaves everything to a spouse with no other provisions. They said the software is pretty good for that, if you want to make sure it gets to your spouse. There's a story, true story, about a Texas gentleman who went online. He's worth about $7 million, but he went online to do his will online. And he missed at that point. State taxes were a little lower, and he subjected or opened up $3.5 million of his estate to estate taxes that could have been avoided. So he was saving pennies and losing significant amount. Or this one, another true story. Fellow had a family, and he had a son that he wanted to leave out. He had some serious drug problems, and he was afraid that the drug problems would be a real problem. This is a story. I don't know where it took place, but it was in the news. And in writing his will himself, he forgot two key things. Number one, he forgot that he owned some stock in telecommunications. He'd bought it years ago, and it turned out that what he'd bought for hundreds of dollars had gone well over $1 million. Number two, he had not put what we call a residuary clause, or that's the remnant clause. Everything else that's left, here's where it should go. And so when the will went to probate, his son ended up with about $400,000 that his dad had intended not to send his way. And in 1 year with his drug habit, he burned through that $400,000 that he had wanted to send elsewhere. He was able to do the estate planning on the cheap, but it cost a lot. It's just a news story. Oh, and here's the bonus as far as deadly things to do. And we see it all the time, and we highly advise against it. And that is putting your kids' names on your bank account as joint owners. Okay, so what's the problem? Well, you may say, I trust them, or they're my executor. Here's the deal. If my parents put me on their financial account, who owns the account? They do, and I do, right? 100%. Each of us is a full owner. What happens if I get involved in an automobile accident and my insurance does not fully cover? Does the court look at that account and say, well, that was a convenience thing that, that mom and dad just put you on so you could help them with writing checks? Or does the court say, here's one more asset that could be used to pay off the judgment? It's going to be the latter. So what we're talking about here is not a trust issue, it's a liability issue. And we see far too many people who, trying to do the right thing, or their kids have encouraged them trying to do the right thing. Here, why don't you put my name on and I can write checks when that becomes difficult for you or something like that. Probably not a big deal if the account is, $2,000 goes up and down. Not a big deal. But we see kids' names on accounts that are $300,000. That's money that you don't want to lose. And here's the deal. By executing a good power of attorney, financial power of attorney, you can give that same child all the rights to write checks, to open and close bank accounts for you as needed, etc., but none of the liability. They are a signer, not an owner. Okay? The chance that something's going to happen is small, but it certainly can. I mean, it can be not just an automobile accident, it could be a divorce. That could be a divorce asset. That would be ugly. You've worked away and here's your retirement, and it goes at a time and to somebody who probably, unfortunately, is no longer your favorite daughter-in-law or son-in-law. Bad news. And so we just encourage people, you can have all the rights and none of the liability. Just do a good power of attorney document and you're taken care of. Does that make sense? You yeah. The children. So because the children, yes, anything that could result in a judgment or a division of assets, because the child is actually a joint owner of that full account. And so it's not that you don't trust them, or when we come and say, oh, you shouldn't do that, we're saying you shouldn't trust your kid. No, it's, what happens, anything that could result in money flowing away from that child, be it a judgment, a divorce, if it's a professional, it could be a malpractice lawsuit, a doctor. We see, doctor sons they've gotten on just to help mom and dad. All the intentions are right. There's nothing wrong that way. It's just they're a joint owner, and if there's ever assets needed to satisfy something, or if there's a divorce and they go dividing what are your assets, the court may not exempt that $250,000 checking savings account because in their eyes it is owned. It has challenges, not good challenges. Now, will it happen to everybody? No. Will it happen to most people? No. But boy, it can be devastating if it's a large account. That's where I say if it's small, if it's the size of probably most of our checking accounts where we operate just within the month, not a big deal. But when I'm just sitting on 50, 60, 200,000, that's where we just say consider carefully, and maybe considering making sure you've got a great power of attorney document without it's all the goods without the liabilities. Does that make sense? Yeah.
So if you have a good financial power of attorney statement, how and when does that go into effect?
Oh, great question. And there are two options. When you make the power of attorney document, you get to choose that it's either immediate when you sign it, which usually means that, because most people put their spouses as their attorney in fact, which is another word for their power of attorney person, they put spouses first, and then often they'll have kids below that. So that could become effective immediately. So you just file it, and the spouse knows or the kids know that when the time comes, that's signed, it's ready. If we start to see some decrease in mental capacity, or you can have it become effective when a physician says that you are unable to do your own affairs, technically incompetent.
So do they have to prove that you're technically incompetent?
It would be when a physician, we have them from time to time, they'll write a letter that says, having known and examined this individual, and the bar is very high. I wouldn't worry so much about the bar being too low. I would actually worry about it being too high. I have seen, and these are people that were super close to me. They were leaders in my church. But over time, we all start to fail. And they were generous people, and they started giving to everything that came in their mailbox. Anybody get things in your mailbox that right now you're not giving to? They gave big checks, and the kids wanted to step in, but they'd put the clause that said, until a physician indicates an incapacity. And the physician isn't going to say, oh, they can't remember where they put their keys. No, the bar is really high, and it was actually very difficult to get anybody who would say, okay, they meet the statute for incompetence. It can't be just they're sharp in the morning and poor in the afternoon. No, it's a very high bar. And so I tend to see family frustrated that they can't be of help because they've put that. Either one is good. I will tell you, one of my favorite young lawyers, I say young, but he's practiced for a good 20 plus years. He says, if you won't trust them until you're incompetent, Why are you trusting them? If you don't trust them while you can watch them, why would you trust them when you're incompetent? Because I actually see people who will say, well, I'll have a physician, because I really am not sure about them handling my stuff, so I don't want them getting onto it too quick. It's like, boy, if you are worried about that, reconsider. But those are the two options. It can be immediate, or it can be when a physician indicates an incapacity. You can look at the back sheet on your paper. I'm going to wind it up here. I'm watching the clock, so don't think I'm going on forever. I just wanted to point out a couple things. These are the components that make up a good estate plan. So these all feed into your estate plan. You've got your will. We're pretty clear on what your will does. It passes to somebody else the different stuff that you own, right? It's also the place where young families will indicate who the guardian would be for their kids, who would take their kids into their home if something happened to both of them. It's a place for them to indicate the trustee, who would manage the money on behalf of the kids until the kids are old enough to do it on their own. So for young families, the will not just deal with stuff, it will deal with the most precious thing, and that's who takes care of my kids, who brings them up, etc. It will also you'll have a personal representative or an executor. We're using more the term personal representative these days. You'll see that. That way it goes either gender, otherwise it's executor and executrix, but personal representative covers both easily enough. You've got durable power of attorney for finances, which is what we were just talking about as the preferred way rather than having somebody else's name on large accounts. Power of attorney for health care, similar, but it's who makes decisions on my behalf medically if I can't make my own decisions. Advanced directive, it goes by a couple different names. Living will, you've heard, living will. Advanced directive, it's the same thing. And or directive to physician, those are a couple different names that it goes by, where it just says, okay, if I am ever terminal, I'm not going to get better, here's what I want or don't want done to preserve my life, prolong it, or not. So you indicate a number of things. You check off the boxes you wish. And then here in community property states like Washington and Idaho, we have a community property agreement if desired, and what that can do, if you don't have separate property that you want to keep separate, you may sign a community property agreement, and that says everything that we own together, and I want to pass it entirely to my spouse upon my death. Actually bypasses probate. So no probate needed if you have that. It passes everything, car, real estate, the whole works, from one spouse to another. So those are the things that make up an estate plan. Everything on this side takes place when I pass away. These are put here to say, who do I want in the right places if I suffer some setbacks mentally or physically. So a good estate plan is not just about what happens when I die. It's not just about who gets my stuff. It's the bigger picture.
The advanced directives can be changed.
You're saying by family? Yeah.
And I have an example of what happened in my family. My stepmother, my father passed away maybe 3, 5, and he spent 2 years on oxygen where he could hardly do anything. He was in bed, 20-some hours a day, and had a miserable time. And
It is not a guarantee, but neither is a will. A will can be challenged if somebody says, I think they were coerced, I think there was undue pressure, etc. However, this is your opportunity to lay out your wishes. And typically, if you've got family that spouse or kids who want to honor your wishes, this spells it out, which is so helpful because sometimes kids legitimately disagree on what they think mom and dad wanted, and having it lined out at least takes that argument off the table. It's kind of the newer term. We're getting away from executor, executrix. See, you'd be an executrix and I'd be an executor. We do the same job. Personal representative covers both genders. I was going fast. You're doing fine. Any questions? I'm ready to wind us up here. Well, thank you. We covered a lot of territory. And if you care to join us tomorrow night, we'll be taking a look at retirement and that kind of thing. So let's go ahead and pray. Heavenly Father, we thank you for loving us and caring for us, for bringing us here tonight, for taking us home safely. And as we've thought about estate planning, really just plans, again, around what you've entrusted to us that we've managed for you in life, and that we have a final management that we can do to bless our families, make a difference in your kingdom. We just pray for your blessing as we each seek to be the very best managers of everything you've entrusted to us, resources, talents, time, etc. Go with us now as we head home. In Jesus' name, amen.